Now, it's lovely to see all of you here, and it's an honour to be a journalist speaking here at the art gallery during an exhibition by Monsieur Monet. Now, Impressionism is an artistic movement whose international fame is beyond dispute. Journalism's contribution to it, however, was characteristically spotty, it grieves me to report. It was actually a journalist, a reviewer no less, who originally coined the term Impressionism. The inadvertent honour fell to the otherwise unlamented Louis Leroy, a contributing wisecracker to the satirical French paper Le Rivalry, progenitor of the British paper Punch. Now, Monsieur Leroy attended the first formalised exhibition mounted by Monet and friends in 1874, an event made necessary by the fact that anybody painting in their controversial new style found themselves unceremoniously bumped from the existing annual Salon de Paris exhibition. Now, the artists at the time, Monet and friends, displaying a certain heaviness of touch for which I think they would not have liked to have become known, called themselves at that time the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors and Engravers. Trust me, it sounds even loftier in French. Now, Le Rivalry, the satirical newspaper, was fairly eager to take the mickey out of this new and ardent group of creative professionals. Let's face it, as a French satirical magazine at that time, they were pretty pleased to find new material of any form. Emperors, kings and governments having displayed in the previous century a remarkable consensus on the matter of banning political caricatures. And I hope you don't mind if I read you a slab of Leroy's copy. It's quite good. His review of the exhibition, the first by Monet and friends, takes the form of a conversation between the fictitious narrator and his fictitious guest, a landscape artist called Monsieur Vincent, whose shock and dismay at the debased artistic standards of the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors and Engravers eventually drives him to such madness that he becomes possessed with the spirit of Impressionism itself. I led him before the ploughed field of Monsieur Pissarro. At the sight of this astounding landscape, the good man thought that the lenses of his spectacles were dirty. He wiped them carefully and replaced them on his nose. "By Michelin," he cried, "what on earth is that?" You see, it's a hoarfrost on deeply ploughed furrows. Those furrows? That? Frost? But they are palette scrapings, placed uniformly on a dirty canvas. It has neither head nor tail, top nor bottom, front nor back. Yes, perhaps, but the impression is there. Well, it's a funny impression. And what's this? An orchard by Monsieur Sisley. I'd like to point out the small tree on the right. It's gay, but the impression... Oh, leave me alone now with your impression. It's neither here nor there. But here we have a view of Melun by Monsieur Rouat, in which there's something to the water. The shadow in the foreground, for instance. It's really peculiar. Yes, it's the vibration of tone which astonishes you, the narrator replies. Call it the sloppiness of tone, and I'd understand you better. Oh, Corot, Corot, what crimes are committed in your name? It was you who brought into fashion this messy composition, these thin washes, these mud splashes in front of which the art lover has been rebelling for 30 years, and which he has accepted only because constrained and forced to do it by your tranquil stubbornness. Once again, a drop of water has worn away the stone. The cabbages of Monsieur Pissarro stopped him as he was passing by, and from red he became scarlet. Those are cabbages, I told him in a gently persuasive voice. Oh, the poor wretches! Aren't they caricatured? I swear not to eat any more as long as I live. The review continues as the pair stroll around the exhibition, and over the course of the piece, Leroy's character, Monsieur Vincent, becomes unhinged by the spectacle to the extent that he actually begins to sympathise with the economy of the Impressionist style. He begins to criticise the paintings he sees for their overuse of paint and indulgent excess of detail. Yes, Boudin has some talent, he remarks before a beach scene by that artist, Monet's mentor. But why does he fiddle so with his marines? Now take Mademoiselle Morisot, he continues. That young lady is not interested in reproducing trifling details. When she has a hand to paint, she makes exactly as many brush strokes lengthwise as there are fingers, and the business is done. Renoir's Harvesters, in whose detail can be found 3 stripes of colour depicting a distant man lost in the golden profusion of a wheat field, is similarly dismissed. There are 2 stripes too many in Monsieur Vincent's newborn opinion, where 1 would have done. And finally he comes before Monsieur Monet's great work. "Ah, there he is," he cried in front of number 98. "I recognise him. What does that canvas depict? Look at the catalogue. It's called Impression Sunrise. Yes, impression. I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." At this point, poor Monsieur Vincent finally loses it altogether. Finally, the picture ran over. The classic skull of Père Vincent, assailed from too many sides, went completely to pieces. He paused before the municipal guard who watches over all these treasures and, taking him to be a portrait, began for my benefit a very emphatic criticism. "Is he ugly enough?" he remarked, shrugging his shoulders. "From the front, he has 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth. Impressionists wouldn't have thus sacrificed to detail. With what the painter has expended in the way of useless things, Monet would have done 20 municipal guards." "Keep moving, will you?" says the portrait. "Ah, you hear him, he even talks. The poor fool who daubed at him must have spent a lot of time at it." And there the piece ends. Monsieur Leroy gave his piece the facetious title, "The Exhibition of the Impressionists," and the term stuck. After all, it gave the group an opportunity to cut 6 whole words from their cumbersome name, which must, in their circumstances, have been irresistible. But what Monsieur Leroy was actually doing in his review was sketching quite an impressive, in fact, quite an impressionist little evocation of what that famous exhibition might have looked and felt like. Certainly it delivered a pretty clear image of what the attitudes of some of its visitors might at the time have been. Unfortunately, it also gives us a rather clear and somewhat unedifying view of the role available to journalists at the birth of a rich new intellectual movement. We tend to stand around and take the mickey out of it, then fade into obscurity while the object of our ridicule prospers. I assure you, I'm going to feel similarly stupid when Kevin Rudd brings peace to the Middle East and wins his Nobel and is photographed by Annie Leibovitz and appears in a U2 film clip. Now you're laughing, but if you think about it, not all of those things are completely impossible, are they? That's the scary part. Poor Monsieur Leroy. He was also an engraver of some merit. But who remembers that now? Nobody. His contribution to the Impressionist movement was to christen it, utterly inadvertently, and contrary to his own satirical purpose, and then fade to nothing. But life isn't all bad for journalists. After all, we're actually encouraged to reduce living things, great people, great events and great visions to an economical arrangement of tiny strokes on a page. And like the Impressionists, we have found that less can on many occasions be more. And at this notion's very extreme, we have the headline. Truly a noble and challenging impressionistic art. Now, I think a great headline can be every bit as satisfying as a great feature. The best headlines, like the best articles, take an idea that's already germinating in the mind of the reader and develop it in a way that's so striking that for a moment the reader is perfectly overcome. My personal taste, of course, is for political headlines, and a great one that I recall from last year during the federal election campaign was one that was actually published in my competition newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, who on the day that interest rates rose ran a picture of John Howard leaving Kirribilli with the headline, "This man could lose his house." Tremendous piece of work. But one of my favourite political headlines, one of the greatest headlines ever, I think, was written in Britain on September the 16th, 1992. John Major's Conservative government had a dreadful year of it. Dreadful year or two of it, actually, truth be told, with cabinet ministers being busted for having loved children, mistresses, unorthodox private sexual practices, and all those other leisure pursuits that have come ever since, somehow to be irrevocably associated with the British Conservatives. John Major himself, as we were to find out a whole decade later, was himself carrying on with the dreadful Edwina Currie, who was briefly a junior health minister, until she was sacked over some comments she made about salmonella in eggs. Henceforth known, of course, deliciously as the curried egg affair. Thanks to her diaries, which were just awful and to which I am, of course, completely addicted, we now know that she was carrying on with Major at the time. Anyway, I'm getting off the track. The Chancellor at the time, the Treasurer's equivalent in Britain, was himself reeling in 1992 from the revelation that the tenant renting the basement flat below his home, who had billed herself in her rental application as a natural therapist, was in fact offering extremely natural therapy to gentlemen callers at 50 quid a throw. So the scene is set. On the 16th of September 1992, hitherto known as Black Wednesday, the pressing issue was Major and Lamont's insistence that Britain remain within the European exchange rate mechanism. The pound came under fierce attack from currency speculators. Major and Lamont held out and decided that to defend the poor quid, they would raise interest rates. And in one single day, September the 16th, 1992, they raised interest rates to 10%, then 12%, then ultimately 15%. In one day. Keep in mind, these were the economic conservatives, and this was only 16 years ago. Can you imagine Peter Costello or Wayne Swan with a hooker in the basement, doubling interest rates over the course of a single day? We never get any fun here, do we? The British public, incidentally, have at least kept their hand in this game by enlisting a current Chancellor called Darling, which somehow guarantees the hilarity of the enterprise, doesn't it? Think about it. There is actually nowadays, no way to report fiscal policy in the United Kingdom without being funny. Taxes are up, darling. Time for a stimulus package, darling. Relief at hand, darling. Oh, it's so good. Anyway, back to 92. Ultimately, at the end of that tumultuous day, Major and Lamont pulled out of the exchange rate mechanism, but the Bank of England lost £9 billion. Starting to sound kind of cheap, actually, by today's standards. And the pair of them lost a lot of skin on the economic management front, as you can imagine. And at the end of that day, John Major gingerly telephoned the notorious Kelvin Mackenzie, editor of The Sun, and asked him what he was planning to do with the next day's paper. Major nervously reminded the editor that The Sun had been demanding for some time that the government withdraw from the exchange rate mechanism. Were they going to get a pat on the back? The editor was silent for a minute, then responded, and I've slightly bowdlerised this quote just in case there's youngsters in the audience. Prime Minister, I have on my desk in front of me a very large bucket of excrement, which I'm about to pour all over you. was the editor's response. And the next day, the front page of the Sun newspaper read, "Now we've all been screwed by the cabinet." Now that is terrific writing. It took a wild and disordered, complex series of events, summed them up crisply in a way that immediately made sense to the paper's readership, whilst placing the entire thing in the context of the year's events, and made people laugh, all in 8 words. Now I know, you don't have to tell me we've strayed a long way from Monet, obviously. Partly, I must confess, I just wanted to tell that anecdote. But there is a way in which it is possible for a political hack such as myself to feel a flimsy spider's web strand of connection to the great Impressionist master. Monet has been called a great painter of time. He captures time not by measuring it on a clock, but by observing the changes that are brought about in his subject, by the changing of circumstance, by the passing of the seasons, by the journey of the sun each day from the east to the west. And in Monet's case, this involved painting the same haystack a dozen times, or a river bend, or a stand of poplar trees, or the Japanese bridge over his pond at Giverny. The objective is to arrive at a greater truth about one's subject by returning to it again and again, each time winkling out a tiny further flash of insight, each time getting marginally closer to a perfect understanding. The challenge is to ignore the tedium that grows around you like a thicket and resist the temptation to make assumptions based on your earlier considerations of the subject. The challenge is to look at the subject every time as though you were seeing it for the very first time. This is an accomplishment that runs very much against the grain of human instinct, which is to fall asleep, which is why Monet's achievement is all the more impressive. Think about it. On 2 visits to Rouen, he painted the cathedral 30 times, driven nearly to distraction by the task of eliciting the truth of its architectural complications and relationship to the light. "Every day I make additions and I latch onto something that I haven't yet been able to see," he wrote home on a postcard in 1892, whilst nutting out the challenge of Rouen. "It's terribly difficult, but it's moving ahead. I'm wrecked, worn out. I had a night filled with nightmares. The cathedral fell on top of me. It looked blue or pink or yellow." One does feel for Monet in his lonely struggle, man versus monolith. But just ask any political writer who packed an easel every day for 11.5 years to sit in repeated observation of John Howard. There is something of the Rouen Cathedral about John Howard. Both of them are massive edifices, seemingly immovable, and both bear the obvious scars of ancient political strife. One of them was ransacked by right-wing religious extremists early in the 16th century and was heavily scarred by 20th century conflict and had many of its treasures sold off by the communists. And that's just Howard. The cathedral's seen a few knocks too. Rouen Cathedral, I didn't know this, contains a tomb to Richard the Lionheart, which, with a degree of literalism that John Howard could only envy, actually contains Richard's heart. His bowels, you'll be relieved to hear, are elsewhere, buried near the site of his fatal wounding in April 1199. See, John Howard too learned halfway through his career in politics that some organs do not belong together. When you follow John Howard's movements for a long time, you tend to see rather a lot of his brain. And a fascinating Gothic sort of brain it is, too. You see a bit of his heart, but he has learned to keep his spleen pretty much hidden. It's very rare that you see him venting it, so used has he become to criticism of one form of another over his 30 years in politics. Some people reckon he gave it to his wife to look after, and There may be some truth to that. Finally, Rouen Cathedral has a structure added in the early 16th century called the Butter Tower. It was built with taxes collected from those soft-living diocesans who refused to give up butter for Lent. Howard too built a few butter towers over the years, although they were periodically melted down for use as palm grease. Like Monet, we discovered over long years of contemplation that our subject was much more changeable than he first appeared. But if Howard was Rouen Cathedral, then Kevin Rudd, I think, is more of a haystack. And I'm not saying that just because of the hair, don't laugh. He is a structure of much more recent provenance, and he owes his existence more to advantageous seasonal conditions, I think, than to generations of backbreaking labour and frustration. Now, this is not to suggest that he is a lesser subject for the Impressionist's eye. Indeed, we're not long into the reign of the Rudbot, and already he is showing some remarkably chameleonic tendencies. It all depends, as Monet so presciently established, on the prevailing light. There's nothing quite like falling in love by firelight, don't you think? And that's what Australia did in 2007. It fell in love with Kevin Rudd, all bathed in the rosy glow of a coalition government which had set itself on fire. A lot of the dead wood caught easily, and the conflagration was soon out of control. And in that flickering romantic light, it was easy to see in the young successor everything that the heart could desire. Who can forget the APEC conference right here in Sydney in September, when the Liberals poured petrol everywhere and Alexander Downer sent it whooshing off with that fateful cigar? In the light of the leaping flames consuming the government of Australia, we saw Kevin Rudd arise, pure of heart and flushed of face and speaking Mandarin. Who cared that his two central promises, to take drastic action on climate change and to contain cost of living increases, were so dramatically, operatically irreconcilable? Who cared? Love is like that, as the Premier might observe. But as the skies darkened this year, we saw our new Prime Minister change quite quickly. The strong greens of his campaign, for instance, do seem to have become a bit more muted in the intervening year. And his budgeting style, which promised to be very much a black-dominated affair, has in the space of a year developed a distinct reddish tinge. And in other lights, he seems at times a different person altogether. In the glamorous fizz of a paparazzi flashbulb, he's Kevin the superstar, friend of the famous and protector of the arts. In the richly haunted light of the Henson studio, however, a different figure emerges, something much more politically prosaic. And as the company changes, so does the Prime Minister. During the election campaign, I saw him in Tasmania campaigning among lumberjacks. Now, the politician among lumberjacks is rather an interesting proposition. Quite often they tend to sound a little more blokey than is entirely necessary. And at this press conference, I seem to remember the Prime Minister in waiting talking about being down here with you blokes having a yarn about what's got to happen with the forests. Not 3 days later, I saw him at the launch of his MySpace page, where, lovingly surveyed by an audience of 15-year-olds, he promised to have his website pimped. I hope that'll be the first and last time I see Kevin Rudd talk about having anything pimped. I'm sure you join me in that sentiment. You know, if there's one thing that John Howard never really was from day to day, it was a mystery. But I don't think that any of us really has a handle on this new guy just yet. Perhaps we just haven't been watching for long enough. Now, it would be unfair to end a discussion of this type without a quick glance at Mr. Rudd's present competition. Malcolm Turnbull, I think, if you had to pick a Monet subject, would have to be the Japanese bridge at Giverny. Stylish, accomplished, impressive, and no amount of changing light or seasonal variation will ever succeed at making either Malcolm Turnbull or that Japanese bridge look anything but exotic and incredibly expensive. My favourite thing about Malcolm Turnbull is his declaration in the Members' Interest Register. This is something that you can go and read if you go to the Sergeant-at-Arms office, and every MP is obliged to fill it out. It's a declaration of all the worldly goods. Now, most MPs run to maybe 2-3 pages. I think I've forgotten how many are in the Turnbull Declaration. Hundreds. It's great reading. And at the very end, there's one more box that you have to fill in if you've still got stuff to declare after the previous 30 pages. And it just says, is there anything else you own apart from everything you've already disclosed that's worth more than $7,000? And the Turnbull Register just says, boats, comma, furniture, comma, artworks. It's fantastic. But really, a Japanese bridge in northern France, Malcolm Turnbull, leader of the Liberal Party, they really are allied objects. Now, a common accusation levelled against journalists is that we have short attention spans and that we crave novelty above all things, and I'm afraid that that is substantially true of me. But one of the most exciting parts of the current political situation, I think, is this rivalry between Rudd and Turnbull, two entirely new players to the political scene. So when I go to work these days and I put out my easel and take my seat, it feels, I think, something like approaching what Monet might have felt seating himself in front of a completely new stand of poplars, full of possibility. Thank you.